Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving deep into one of the wildest, most controversial studies in the history of psychology, David Rosenhan's On Being Sane in Insane Places. So let's start with the big question that drove this whole thing, posed by psychologist David Rosenhan back in 1973. For him, this wasn't just some philosophical thought experiment. It was a direct challenge to the very foundations of psychiatric diagnosis. You see, Rosenhan wanted to test a really simple but kind of profound idea. Can the experts, the very people in psychiatric hospitals, truly tell the difference between someone who is sane and someone who is insane? Or, and this is the kicker, do the diagnoses have more to do with the hospital environment itself than the actual patient? Now, to get an answer to a question like that, you can't just, send out a survey. He had to go undercover. So he cooked up this pretty daring experiment that, let me tell you, sent some major shockwaves through the world of psychiatry. Here's what he did. He put together this team of 8 totally sane people to act as pseudo-patients. And this wasn't just some random group. We're talking psychologists, a psychiatrist, a pediatrician, even Rosenhan himself was one of them. Their mission? Get themselves admitted to 12 different hospitals across 5 states. And their plan to get in? It was almost shockingly simple. They'd just call for an appointment, use a fake name and job, mostly to protect their reputations later, and then report just one single made-up symptom. These were the only words they claimed to hear. And they picked these words on purpose, right? They kind of suggest this deep, existential feeling, but they aren't actually linked to any known symptom of schizophrenia. And here's the key part. Besides that one little lie, everything else they talked about, their lives, their pasts, their relationships, was all completely true. Okay, so the plan worked. They all got in. But what happens next? What happened when these perfectly sane people were on the inside, surrounded by the very experts who are supposed to be able to spot mental illness? Well, the second they were officially admitted, the show was over. They immediately stopped faking any symptoms at all and just acted completely normal. Their new mission was simple: act sane enough for the staff to let them out. But it turns out getting out was way, way harder than getting in. The average time they were stuck in there was 19 days. Can you imagine? One person was in for 52 days. All of them, totally sane, were pretty much desperate to get out almost from the minute they got in. And this is probably the most damning part of the whole thing. Not one single psychiatrist, nurse, or staff member ever figured out that these people were fakes. What's really interesting, though, is that some of the actual patients caught on. One of them even said, "You're not crazy, you're a journalist or a professor." But the professionals, nope, they had no idea. And that right there gets to the heart of the problem. 7 of the 8 were diagnosed with schizophrenia. And when they were finally let go, they weren't called sane. No, the hospital discharged them with a diagnosis of schizophrenia in remission. That label, once it's on you, it seems like it's almost impossible to get rid of it. In fact, things they did that were completely normal were seen through this new lens of mental illness. For example, one of the pseudo-patients was taking notes for the experiment, right? Well, in his hospital records, a nurse wrote, "Patient engages in writing behavior," as if just writing things down was some kind of strange, pathological tic. So what Rosenhan's experiment showed so powerfully was just how sticky these diagnostic labels can be. Once you're labeled schizophrenic, it's like everything you do, every single action, is seen as just another symptom of that illness. The label itself starts to create the reality. Okay, so as you can probably guess, the psychiatric world was pretty shocked by all this. And some were, well, pretty skeptical. The staff at one hospital was so sure this could never happen with them, they actually challenged Rosenhan. They basically said, "Go ahead, send fake patients to us, we'll spot them." And Rosenhan said, "Okay, game on." So for the next 3 months, 193 new patients were admitted to that hospital. The staff was on super high alert, right? They were examining every single person, trying to find the imposters they were sure Rosenhan was sending. And out of those 193 real patients, the staff felt totally confident that they had identified 41 of them as fakes. They even marked another 42 as suspect. They were positive they had caught Rosenhan's people. But here's the crazy twist. Rosenhan hadn't sent anyone, not a single fake patient, 0. The hospital staff, in their rush to spot the sane people faking insanity, ended up misidentifying their own actual patients. It just showed this huge diagnostic problem, but from the complete opposite direction. The study didn't just point out problems with how people were diagnosed. It also uncovered this really troubling culture inside these hospitals, a kind of depersonalization. The pseudo-patients wrote down how they and the other patients were basically ignored, treated like they were invisible. And to put some numbers on this, the pseudo-patients would go up to staff members and ask a simple, polite question, something like, "Excuse me, when will I be eligible for grounds privileges?" And the results were, well, they were pretty stark. As you can see from the data, 71% of psychiatrists and a whopping 88% of nurses in attendance just kept walking, head averted, and completely ignored the question. Now, to see just how different this was, they ran a similar test on a university campus. A student went up to a professor and asked a simple question. And what happened? 100% of the professors stopped and talked to the student. It was like the hospital environment itself just stripped away basic human kindness. So, after all that, what's the big takeaway here? What did this huge, controversial study really teach us about that blurry line between what we call sane and insane? Well, Rosenhan's conclusion was pretty direct. He basically said, look, the problem isn't that the staff are bad people or that they're incompetent. The real problem is that the psychiatric hospital setting itself creates this powerful bias that makes it almost impossible to see people clearly. Yeah, everything gets filtered through this lens of sickness. The label patient or the diagnosis schizophrenia just becomes the self-fulfilling prophecy. It colors every single thing a person does. In the end, the place you're in, the context, is more powerful than who you actually are. And so here we are. This experiment, which happened decades ago, leaves us with this really deep and honestly pretty unsettling question that still hangs in the air today. It makes us rethink not just how we diagnose mental illness, but how the very places we build to treat it might actually be warping our whole perception of what's real.